Hey everybody, this is Jordan here for the Who You Got podcast. Today we're going to be looking at the ACC Tournament, and we're going to be asking ourselves and our listeners and our viewers, who do you got? Who do you think is going to win the ACC Tournament? And the great thing about this episode is we're not just going to ask who the ultimate winner is going to be. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty. We're going to go through each and every game in the tournament. We're going to be making a bracket. We're going to be saying who we think is going to win the first, second, third, quarterfinals, semifinals, finals. We're going to be going into the details, and we're going to be predicting these games from my perspective and trying to see who's going to win by looking at 11 key stats that are key to any basketball team winning. We're going to be looking at points per game, points allowed per game, field goal percentage, opponent's field goal percentage, point differential. We're going to be looking at SRS, which stands for the Simple Rating System, which is a measure of how good a team is based on their margin of victory and their strength of schedule. We're going to be looking at offensive rating, which is a measure of how efficient and productive a team's offense is. We're going to be looking at opponent's offensive rating, so we're going to try to get a measure of how good a team's defense is by looking at how efficient and productive they allowed their opponents to be. We're going to be looking at strength of schedule. And we're going to be looking at true shooting percentage to see how efficient they are at shooting the ball. So without further ado, let's get to the first game of the of the ACC tournament, which is going to be the Miami Hurricanes versus the Wake Forest Demon Deacons. Now, this game is between two teams that stand almost no chance of winning the ACC tournament, and that's true. The first couple games we're going to go through here, Wake Forest and Miami are both near the bottom of the league tables when it comes to the ACC. But when it comes to this particular matchup, it does appear to me as if Miami has an edge. Miami has a much better point differential than Wake Forest. Miami's point differential is -5 per game, and Wake Forest point differential is -13.5. So Miami has an 8.5 point edge there. Miami scores more points per game, and they allow fewer points per game. They have a higher field goal percentage, and they have a lower field goal percentage for their opponents. Their SRS rating is 7 points higher than Wake Forest. Every stat, every facet of the game seems to suggest that Miami should win this, and that Wake Forest altogether is just kind of bad. So we're going to give this first game in the tournament to the Miami Hurricanes. Now, they probably won't go too far, but they should not have difficulty dispatching Wake Forest. The second game in the tournament that will occur on 2 p.m. on March the 12th, which is tomorrow as of this recording, probably the day of or the day after for you listening to this, is going to be the 10th seed Georgia Tech versus the 15th seed Notre Dame. Now, Notre Dame had the worst record in the conference. In conference play in the entire ACC. They were the bottom trawlers of this conference. And Georgia Tech, while they are no superstar type team, they are a whole lot better than Notre Dame. It's just like the Wake Forest and Miami game, as we talked about earlier. Georgia Tech scores more points per game than Notre Dame. They allow fewer points per game than Notre Dame. They're much more efficient on their field goal percentages and the field goal percentage allowed by the other team. It's difficult to see a situation where Notre Dame wins this game. It is a little closer than the Wake Forest-Miami game, ironically, even though the seeding is further apart. And miracles happen all the time. We're not just necessarily miracles. I mean, we're saying that Notre Dame might have a 20-30% chance of winning this game, or maybe even 40%. Things with those percentages happen all the time. But it is most likely in this scenario that Georgia Tech would come out with the win and advance to the second round of the ACC tournament. Their stat line just shows that they're a much more efficient and productive team on both sides of the ball than Notre Dame, and it's very unlikely that Notre Dame comes away advancing from this game. The third game that we're going to be looking at is the 11th ranked Boston College. I think their mascot is the Eagles. Versus the University of Pittsburgh. This one actually is fairly close. Boston College scores a little bit more points per game than Pittsburgh. They allow more points per game than Pittsburgh. So if you just go by points per game and points allowed per game, Boston College has a better offense but a worse defense. Overall, though, Boston College does have a better point differential by about 1.5 points than Pittsburgh. Boston College is more efficient on offense than Pittsburgh, but they are less effective at stopping opponent offenses. This was going to be a close game. I really do think there's a potential for an upset here. I got to pick Boston College, though. Overall, they are better on offense. The difference between them and Pittsburgh on offense is larger than the difference between Pittsburgh and Boston College on defense. Pittsburgh is only very slightly better than Boston College on defense, but Boston College has some daylight between them and Pittsburgh on offense. So I don't really see how Pittsburgh can make that up. Of course they can. It's possible, but I think it's unlikely. So we're going to be advancing Boston College in that game. We have got the Boston College Eagles advancing to the second round. Now that all the first round games are over, all the games that will occur on March the 12th are over. Now we're getting into the juicier games, the games with a little bit more substance, the games between teams who have a chance of winning the tournament. Even if it's not entirely likely, these teams prove during the season that they are contenders. And they may very well be fighting for a spot in the NCAA tournament. So they've got a lot of incentive to do well in this tournament. Even if they can't win it, a strong showing here could push them into the tournament. So the first game we're looking at will take place on at 12 p.m. on March the 13th. It is the NC State Wolfpack versus the Clemson Tigers, I believe is their mascot. NC State here is probably the better team. It's probably on the margin, so Clemson definitely could come away with this. Clemson actually is better than NC State if you look at conference play. Their points per game is lower than NC State, but their points allowed per game is far lower than NC State. The point differential for Clemson in conference play is 2.5 points, while the point differential for NC State in conference play is only 0.4 points. So Clemson has a 2.1 advantage over NC State in conference play in terms of point differential, which is important because it shows that when they win games, they win them convincingly. They're not winning them. They're not relying as much on luck as NC State is. They're winning games by substantial margins, while NC State was winning games by smaller margins that really could have went either way. However, if you look at simple rating system, which takes into account strength of schedule, NC State has a slight edge here because NC State did play a tougher schedule than Clemson, which could account for the lower point differential. If you look at offensive rating, NC State is just so much more efficient and productive than Clemson. They've got an offensive rating of 111.2. Clemson's got an offensive rating of 102.7. True shooting percentage for NC State is 0.01 points higher than Clemson, which isn't really significant, isn't really a lot, but it is something. And in the ACC tournament where it's one and done, you'll take every edge you can get. This is a close game. There's a potential for an upset here. I had a friend of mine tell me that he actually had a 6-pack of beer bet on this. He said that he thought Clemson was going to win. I got to say NC State, though. The stats seem to show that they've had a tougher season. They've been playing tough opponents, and they've shown up. They have not laid down. They have performed admirably, and it looks like, from a stat perspective, they should pull this out. The next game is my preferred team, the Virginia Tech Hokies. They would be taking on the Miami Hurricanes, assuming that they won their game in the first round, which we predicted they did, so they advanced in the bracket to this game. Now, this one's really not close, and I'm not just saying that because I'm a Hokies fan. Miami is just not on the same level as Virginia Tech. Miami has a negative point differential. Virginia Tech has a positive point differential, which means that Virginia Tech was winning more games than Miami, and they were winning them by larger margins than the Hurricanes were. Virginia Tech has a true shooting percentage far higher, out of Miami's league. The offensive rating for Virginia Tech is a full 10.6 points higher than Miami, and their simple rating is double what the Hurricanes is, it would take a stroke of luck and maybe a little more for the Hurricanes to come out on top in this game. I don't see how they do it. Virginia Tech is superior in pretty much every stat you can look at, whether it's in conference play, whether it's the whole season. They're just so much more efficient and productive. And I keep saying those words because in basketball, it's a sport where luck has a lesser role than in other sports. You look at all the major American sports, football, hockey, baseball, soccer, looking at all of them, basketball is the one that is least based on luck. And so if you look at the stats, they are most predictive in basketball than they are in a sport like football. And if you can be efficient and you can be productive with your touches, especially if you can get a higher volume of them by rebounding and such like that, then chances are you're going to win the game. In football, you can get lucky, you can get a big play, and that one play accounts for a whole lot. 7 points is a lot in a game of football. But in basketball, if you have one big play, then you're only going to get 2 or 3 points in a game where teams routinely score 70, 80, 90, 100 points or more. So the impact of lucky big plays is diminished in basketball compared to other sports like football. And so if you can be efficient throughout the game and productive, you're probably going to come away with a win. And that's why Virginia Tech has such an incredible edge here. I wouldn't be surprised if Virginia Tech wins by double digits against Miami on the 13th. Moving on to the North Carolina Tar Heels going against I skipped ahead of myself. It's actually going to be Louisville versus Georgia Tech. This game, again, not going to be particularly close. Georgia Tech is one of those teams that are probably going to eke out of the first round. Louisville has secured a bye just like Virginia Tech. Louisville is better in every metric. They allow less points. They score more points. They have a higher point differential. They have a positive point differential. Their SRS is more than double what Georgia Tech's is. Their offensive rating is 12 points higher. I don't see a world where Georgia Tech wins this game. I mean, unlikely things happen all the time. You saw it last year in the NCAA tournament. Number one seed Virginia lost to a 16 seed. So things can happen, but I don't see how this happens. It's very unlikely. Louisville's moving on. Syracuse versus Pittsburgh would be the next game, assuming that we are correct and Pittsburgh advances out of the first round. You're going to note a common theme here, which is that teams that have a bye have that bye for a reason. They are simply better than the teams who had to play in the first round, and it's usually not very close. Syracuse has an SRS almost double of Pittsburgh, much higher true shooting percentage, much better point differential. Interesting fact about Syracuse has a point differential of 0, which means that throughout the season, Syracuse and their opponents scored the same amount of points overall. Actually, Syracuse's opponents scored one more point than Syracuse did all season long, but that is remarkably even for a season where a team plays, around 30 games, a little more than 30 games. That's pretty remarkable to be so evenly matched against your opponents. But regardless, Pittsburgh was not. Pittsburgh was much worse than most of the opponents they played, and that is why we are going to advance Syracuse to the third round, which is not quite the semifinals, but it is the quarterfinals. The next match here would be Virginia versus NC State. Now, I know we did a previous podcast talking about Duke versus North Carolina and their rivalry and the history and who we thought were going to win the games this year. We didn't talk a lot about NC State, which is another North Carolina team that's right down the road from teams like UNC and Duke. But NC State just isn't on that level with UNC and Duke. And this game right here shows it. UNC and Duke are top tier. They are contenders for the ACC tournament and the NCAA tournament almost every year. NC State, not so much. And you can see it here. Virginia is a team that is top tier. They had the best record in the conference. They had one of the highest SRS ratings. They had the best defensive rating of any team in the ACC. They were locking people down in conference play, not including the weak teams that you play at the beginning of your schedule. Looking simply at conference play, Virginia allowed opponents to score 56 points per game. 56. Truly remarkable to do throughout an entire season, especially in a tough competitive conference like the ACC. There's no competition here. Virginia is going to blow out NC State unless they collapse like they did last year in the NCAA tournament. I think that's unlikely, though. Virginia has proven that they are strong contenders this year to win it all, not just the ACC tournament, but the NCAA tournament as well. Virginia will be advancing to the quarterfinals. Not the quarterfinals, the semifinals. They will be advancing to the semifinals. The next game, which will be in the quarterfinals, if our bracket is correct, would be Virginia Tech versus the Florida State Seminoles. This game was actually played out less than a week ago at Florida State. It went to overtime, and Florida State won by around 7 or 8 points, I think. These teams are very evenly matched. This game could go either way. Florida State did win their latest matchup, but they had home court advantage when they did so. If you just look at the stats, Florida State is a tough team. They had a remarkable season. They had a point differential better than Virginia Tech. They scored more points per game than Virginia Tech. The ace in the hand that Virginia Tech has, though, is they are so efficient on the offensive side of the ball. They have the highest offensive rating in the ACC, bar Virginia themselves. Virginia Tech has a higher SRS rating because they had a tougher schedule. They have an offensive rating that is 7 points higher than Florida State's. With this game being on a neutral court in Charlotte, I believe, I think Virginia Tech's going to learn lessons from their last defeat in overtime, and they're going to come back and beat Florida State. I might be biased, but I'm just looking at the stats. They had a tougher strength of schedule, and they still managed to have a tougher offensive rating. Virginia Tech's defense is a little weaker than Florida State's, but Virginia Tech just blows Florida State out of the water when it comes to offensive efficiency and production. I got Virginia Tech moving on to the semifinals to face Virginia. Another quarterfinal game, North Carolina Tar Heels versus Louisville. This one could be close. This is North Carolina's first appearance, the first game they would play because they were played so well in the regular season. In conference play, they got a 2-round bye. They went straight to quarterfinals just like Virginia, Duke, and Florida State. I don't see Louisville winning this game. Louisville scores less points per game. They have a worse points differential. UNC has the third highest SRS in the entire conference, which would suggest that they're the third best team in the conference. They have an offensive rating that's only slightly worse than Virginia Tech's, which is the second best in the conference. And UNC plays very good defense. They do not allow many points play. They play at a high pace, which allows teams to score more points. But that's more than made up for the fact that UNC scores a lot of points themselves. They like to run. They like to run a fast break offense. They like to get down the court. They like to grab rebounds on defense, run down the court, and get the easy layup, get the open shot. They do it. They've been doing it for years under Roy Williams. They do it really effectively. I don't see why they can't do it against Louisville. UNC is moving on to the semifinals. The last quarterfinal game we're going to look at for a spot in the semifinals is going to be the Duke Blue Devils versus Syracuse. Duke has the highest SRS in the entire conference. They have one of the highest offensive ratings in the entire conference. They have one of the highest true shooting percentages in the entire conference. They have the, they have the second best defensive rating behind Virginia of any team in the conference, and it's only marginally worse. And we just talked about how dominant Virginia has been on defense this season against ACC opponents. Duke is right there behind them. I don't see Syracuse winning this game. Duke is just so much better on so many sides of the ball. They're better on offense. They're better on defense. You know, some of these games we've had to make a choice between a team who is better on offense and a team who is better on defense. We don't have that dilemma here. Duke is better on both sides of the ball than Syracuse. I don't see how Syracuse advances to the semifinals. They may put up a decent fight. They could pull out a win, especially if Zion is not 100%. That is the X factor for Duke in this tournament. Yeah, Duke is going to have to hope that Zion is healthy because I've been reading some reports. I've been reading some news. It appears that Zion is going to be back for the ACC tournament, and I think that's great. I hope he's healthy. You know, problem is he's a big guy. And being a big guy is a big part of his game. And if he can't put pressure on his feet, on his knee, on his leg, he's not going to be as effective, even if he comes back and is able to play. So you got to hope Zion is 100% or at least 90% able to play. I hope they've rested him long enough. I hope he's fully healed. Duke should probably hope so too, because without Zion, Duke has struggled. They've lost games that they should not have lost, to Virginia Tech, for instance. And they've won games against teams that they should have blown out, but they only won by a few points. So Duke's got to hope Zion's back. I think Zion will be back. I don't think he'll be 100%, but I think he'll be good enough to carry them to a win over the Syracuse team. And I see Duke advancing to the semifinals. All right, so moving on to the semifinals. The last four teams, the final four in the ACC tournament, will be Virginia, Virginia Tech, North Carolina, and Duke, according to my bracket, according to my projections. Let's first start with Virginia and Virginia Tech. Like I said, Virginia has been absolutely dominant this year on both sides of the ball. They run a style of play on offense that is kind of slow. They run a slow pace. They want to control the game. They lock you down on the perimeter on defense, and they make their living from the perimeter on offense. They got a lot of talented guys on the team. Virginia Tech has a talented offense, one of the best in the ACC. They are lacking defensively. They don't have a lot of size. They can't stop opposing offenses with any consistency, with any regularity. Like I said, they lost to Florida State in Tallahassee less than a week ago. I don't see them beating Virginia on a neutral court. They've lost to Virginia twice this year on the road and at home. I don't see a different story in the semifinals. Virginia and the Cavaliers are going to the ACC Championship game. When you look at the University of North Carolina Tar Heels versus the Duke Blue Devils, I encourage you to go watch our last podcast on the history and the rivalry between UNC and Duke. I had my co-host on there, and one of our local sages when it comes to Duke and UNC history. I very much encourage you to go watch that podcast. It was great, filled with a lot of tidbits that I found very interesting. I'm sure you will too. This would be the third time they've met this year. UNC has beat Duke both times in their two previous meetings. Zion didn't play, though. Zion played for about 20 seconds in the first game before he was injured. So if Zion is back, is UNC going to be able to replicate their success? Hard to say. UNC won convincingly in their first game. They won a little bit less convincingly in the second game. It was back and forth. Duke put up a strong fight. If they get Zion back, it's going to be really tough. If you look at the stats with Zion, Duke's a better team. They just are a better team. They're better on defense. They have a high true shooting percentage. Their SRS is higher. North Carolina's a good team. They could beat Duke with Zion. If Zion's back and he's 100%, I got to say Duke wins. I'm advancing the Blue Devils to the championship game. I think Duke's tired of losing to North Carolina this season. I think Zion's going to be back. I think he's going to be hungry. And I think they're going to the championship game against the Virginia Cavaliers. And so when it comes down to the championship game, this is the moment we've all been waiting for. Who do you got in the ACC Championship? Who's going to be the ACC champion? And if you look at the stats, if you look at the numbers, if you look at the games, Virginia has had a streak of dominance throughout the season that has not been paralleled by any team in the conference, save for the Duke Blue Devils with a healthy Zion. Duke is worse in every stat category, or almost every stat category that you can imagine. Duke has a worse defensive rating. They're worse on the offensive side of the ball. They have a worse point differential. Hard to see how Duke, with a possibly injured Zion, beats Virginia. Duke does have an ace that they can, an ace in the hole they can depend on. They've played a tougher schedule than Virginia. They've played tougher teams. Maybe the fact that they've had tougher games and played tough opponents like North Carolina twice. The fact that they have played so many tough teams in an already competitive conference, one of the best in NCAA. In fact, if you look at SRS, ACC in aggregate has the second highest SRS rating of all conferences in the NCAA. Duke's playing a hard conference for the ACC. Maybe the fact that they're battle hardened, maybe the fact that they've seen a lot of things this season, maybe that can propel them to a win over Virginia. Plus, they've got a veteran coach in Krzyzewski. They've won ACC tournaments before. Could they do it again? Of course. This is not going to be a blowout. This is going to be close. But I got to take the Cavaliers. I think the Cavaliers are winning this tournament and all but securing a number 1 seed in the NCAA tournament. I think that Duke will also get a number 1 seed. And UNC may very well too. But it may come down to that UNC-Duke game in the semifinals. So that's going to be huge if that game does indeed occur and no upsets derail that along the way. But that's it, folks. We have got Virginia winning the ACC tournament this year. They've been dominant all season. No signs of slowing down. They've been beating teams left and right in the ACC, out of the ACC. They've been shutting them down, and they've been lighting them up on both sides of the ball. I don't see how Virginia doesn't come away from this tournament as the winner unless Duke can pull some lessons from their tough schedule this year. But I don't think it's going to be enough, especially with a Zion that's probably not going to be 100%. So I'd like to thank you all for listening to the Who You Got podcast. I encourage you to go listen to our other podcast, and I encourage you to subscribe, hit the like button, comment who you think is going to win the ACC tournament. Send us a link to your ACC bracket. Tweet at us. Help support all the hard work we do here to bring you quality content. Thank you so much for listening. Have a good day, and please, by all means, enjoy the ACC tournament.